The cold was a sculptor, and it had carved the world from bone and ice. It flayed the bark from the aspens, scraped the ridges of the canyon into skeletal relief, and laid the creek bare, a vein of black, sluggish water in the white flesh of the land. This was the world Malachi had chosen, or the world that had been left to him after he'd burned all the others. He moved along the creek's edge, the butt of his rifle cold against his gloved palm. The air was so thin and sharp it felt like breathing glass. He was checking his traps, a ritual of grim necessity that did little to quiet the ghosts in his head. The snow under his boots made a sound like tearing linen. It was the only sound, save for the low moan of the wind as it searched the crevices of the rock for something to kill. Then, another sound. It was not the wind. It was not the creek. It was a hitch in the world's frozen breath, a soft, wet noise that did not belong. Malachi froze. His eyes, the color of a winter sky before a storm, scanned the far bank. He was a man built of long lines and hard angles, his face a geography of loss mapped by a beard salted with gray. He had come to this place to be alone, with his particular damnation, and the world had, until now, obliged. He saw it, a splash of color against the unrelenting white, a heap of dark fabric and darker blood, staining the snow in a way that looked blasphemous, like ink spilled on a sacred text. It was huddled near the base of a cottonwood that had long surrendered to the frost. His first instinct was the one that had kept him alive this long. Turn, walk away, and forget what he saw. This was not his business. Nothing was his business anymore. Bringing anything from the outside world into his Hermitage was like carrying a lit torch into a powder magazine. Especially this. He could see the fringe of buckskin, the dark, straight fall of hair. Apache. He stayed rooted to the spot, a statue of indecision. The wind tugged at his coat, whispering the old arguments of survival. But another voice, one he had tried to bury for a decade under miles of wilderness and barrels of whiskey, stirred in the pit of his gut. It was the voice of the man he'd been before the uniform, before the long ride south, before the smoke and the screaming. He cursed, the word a plume of white vapor instantly snatched away by the wind. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and began to cross the creek, his boots punching through the thin crust of ice near the edges, the black water seizing his ankles with a pain that was immediate and profound. It felt like a penance. Good. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. Not a warrior, not a woman, a child. A girl, maybe 8 or 9 winters old. She was curled into a knot of agony, one small hand pressed against her side. Her deerskin dress was stiff with frozen blood. Her face, when he finally saw it, was serene in its suffering, her eyes closed, her lips a pale, bloodless line. She wore the look of someone who had already made their peace with the end. His gaze fell to the wound, a bullet hole. Small caliber, messy, a settler's rifle, most likely. Fired in fear or in hate, it made no difference to the result. She was dying. He knelt, the cold of the snow seeping through the knees of his canvas trousers. He reached out a hand, then hesitated. His hands were calloused, scarred, the hands of a man who had broken things, horses, land, oaths. He remembered the blue of the coat he once wore, the glint of the brass buttons, the weight of the Colt on his hip. He remembered the smell of gunpowder. On a hot, gusty wind in the high, thin wail that a child makes when its world is set on fire, the girl's eyes flickered open. They were not the eyes of a child. They were ancient, dark and deep, like wells that held the memory of 1,000 sorrows. There was no fear in them. Only a vast, weary resignation. She saw him, the white man, the enemy, and something in her seemed to break, a final thread of hope snapping. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "It's all right," Malachi whispered, the words feeling clumsy and false in his mouth. He expected her to fight, to scream, to spit at him. She did none of those things. She simply watched him, her breathing a shallow, rattling thing. He knew that if he left her, the cold and the wound would claim her before the next sunrise. And if he took her, he was pulling the pin from a grenade that had been waiting a lifetime to explode. He was inviting a reckoning that he had spent 10 years trying to outrun. He looked up at the sky. A lone hawk circled high above, a speck of black against the merciless gray. It made no sound. The entire world was holding its breath, waiting for his choice. The girl's lips moved, and a sound barely audible escaped. It was not a word in his tongue. It was a whisper, a name, a prayer meant for a god he did not know. Shikaze, my friend, my relative. The word struck him harder than a fist. It was not meant for him, but in that moment, in that frozen purgatory, it was the only thing he heard. He slipped his arms beneath her, his movements clumsy with a tenderness he thought had died in him long ago. She was impossibly light, a bundle of fragile bones and fading warmth. As he lifted her, her head lolled against his chest, and her breath, smelling of blood and dust, ghosted across his neck. He stood, the water in his boots freezing solid around his feet, and turned back toward the lonely column of smoke that marked his cabin. He was no longer just a man in exile. He was a thief. He had stolen a life from the edge of the grave, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the ice, that the one she belonged to would come to collect the debt. The land was silent, but he had just given it something to talk about. And it would answer. The cabin was a testament to a man trying to erase himself. It was built of rough-hewn pine, chinked with mud and moss, and consisted of a single room that held a cot, a stone hearth, a table, and one chair. It smelled of wood smoke, pine resin, and a solitude so profound it felt like a physical presence. He laid her on his cot, the only soft place in the entire structure. The rough wool of his blanket seemed to abrade her delicate skin. For a moment, she was just a broken doll, lost and out of place in his coarse world. Then she moaned, a low, guttural sound of pure pain, and she was terribly, frighteningly real. He worked with a grim, focused desperation. He stoked the fire until it blazed, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. He stripped off his frozen boots and socks, his feet a mottled red and white, but he ignored the biting pain. He set a pot of water to boil and tore strips from his cleanest shirt, a luxury he hadn't afforded himself in years. He had to get the bullet out. As he gently cut away the blood-caked deerskin, he saw the full extent of the damage. The bullet had gone in clean, but it had torn through her side, and the wound was inflamed and angry. She was burning with fever. Her skin was dry and hot to the touch, and a faint tremor ran through her limbs. She was conscious, her dark eyes following his every move. They were wide with pain and a deep, unnerving watchfulness. There was no trust in that gaze, only a raw assessment of the threat he posed. He was a man. He was a white man. For her, that was likely the beginning and end of the story. I have to clean it," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He held up his knife, its blade sterilized in the flames, and a bottle of whiskey. "This will hurt." She did not flinch. She did not cry out. She simply stared at him, her jaw set. It was the kind of bravery he'd seen in seasoned warriors, not in a child. He saw the faint, intricate lines tattooed on her wrist, a pattern he didn't recognize but knew was a mark of her clan, her identity. A shiver of a memory, cold and sharp, went through him. He remembered another wrist, another pattern, a hand going limp in the dust of a burned-out village. He pushed the memory down, locking it away in the cold, dark place where he kept all the others. He gave her a strip of leather to bite down on. She took it, her small teeth sinking into the hide. The next 10 minutes were an eternity of controlled violence. He probed the wound, his big hand surprisingly steady. He felt the sickening scrape of steel on lead, and sweat beaded on his forehead, stinging his eyes. The girl's body went rigid. A strangled cry was torn from her throat, muffled by the leather, but he heard it. He heard it in his soul. It was the sound of all the pain he had ever caused, all the suffering he had ever witnessed, condensed into one unbearable moment. Finally, he worked the mangled piece of lead free. It fell onto the wooden floor with a soft, heavy clink. He dropped his knife and slumped back, his own breathing as ragged as hers. He cleaned the wound with whiskey, and this time she screamed, a raw, piercing sound that seemed to shake the very logs of the cabin. Then, mercifully, she fell into the abyss of unconsciousness. He bandaged her tightly with the clean strips of cloth. He wiped the sweat and tears from her face with a damp rag. He covered her with his blanket and sat in the lone chair, watching the frantic rise and fall of her chest. The cabin was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was a shared silence, thick with the metallic scent of blood, and the ghosts of two separate, broken pasts. He was no hero. He knew that with a gut-deep certainty. He was a deserter. He had worn the blue coat of a cavalry scout. He had led a detachment under a man named Major Thorne, a man who believed the only good Apache was a dead one. He had led them through canyons and across mesas he knew like the back of his own hand. Land he had once respected, land he had learned from an old trapper who had lived among the people. He had led them to a place called Ash Creek. He had thought it was a reconnaissance mission, a show of force. Thorne had promised no blood would be shed. Malachi, younger then, and desperate for the pay, had believed him. He had watched from a ridge as the soldiers descended upon the small, sleeping encampment. He had watched the smoke rise, heard the volley of rifles, the screams of women, the defiant war cries of the few warriors who managed to find their weapons. He saw the blue coats move through the tipis, methodical and brutal. And he had done nothing. He had sat on his horse on that ridge, a Judas in a government issue coat, and watched the world burn. He deserted that night, melting into the wilderness that had once been his sanctuary, but it was a sanctuary no more. It was a witness. To his shame, every hawk's cry sounded like an accusation. Every gust of wind whispered the names of the dead. He had been running ever since, not from the law, but from the face of the old woman who had looked up at him from the dust of Ash Creek, her eyes full of a sorrow so vast it had swallowed him whole. Now a child of those same people lay in his bed. He looked at her, so small and still. She was a living ember from the fire that had consumed his soul. Her presence in his cabin was not a chance for redemption. It was a judgment. She was his past, made flesh and blood, come to lie in his bed and breathe his air. He stared into the fire, the flames licking at the logs. He remembered the fire at Ash Creek. It had not been for warmth. It had been for annihilation. He watched the girl in the cot, her face slack in a feverish sleep, and he saw a flicker of that same fire in his own hearth. She stirred, her small hand clenching and unclenching on the blanket. She stared at the flames, her eyes wide and unfocused, as if she were seeing not the gentle dance of the fire in his hearth, but the roaring inferno that had killed someone she loved. Two ghosts under one roof. A man haunted by what he had done, and a child haunted by what had been done to her. Their silence was a conversation, a battlefield where their two worlds collided with the force of an earthquake, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the unsteady beat of two wounded hearts. The days that followed blurred into a single sustained prayer. The girl's fever raged, a wildfire consuming her from within. Malachi fought it with the grim patience of a man who had nothing left to lose. He forced broth between her cracked lips, a spoonful at a time. He bathed her forehead with snowmelt, the shock of the cold, a desperate anchor to the world of the living. He brewed teas from willow bark and yarrow, remedies he had learned from Alara, his wife in another life. Before she herself was taken by a fever he had been powerless to stop. The memory was a fresh wound, and every moment he spent tending to the Apache child felt like a frantic attempt to rewrite his own history of failure. He moved about the small cabin with a reverent quiet. He found the soldier's coat he had cut. From her, it was a child's coat, crudely made, but the fabric was unmistakable, coarse blue wool, the kind issued by the army. Someone had fashioned it for her, a spoil of war, a gift from a traitor. It didn't matter. It was a symbol of the world that had tried to kill her. He took it outside, dug a hole in the frozen earth with the head of his axe, and buried it. As he packed the dirt over it, he felt as if he were burying a piece of his own rotted past. On the third day, the fever broke. He woke to find her watching him, her eyes clear for the first time. The ancient weariness was still there, but beneath it, a flicker of something new, curiosity. She was weak, but she was alive. He offered her a bowl of thin rabbit stew. She pushed herself up on one elbow, her movements slow and deliberate. She took the bowl from him, her small fingers brushing against his. The touch was electric, a spark of contact across a chasm of blood and history. She ate slowly, methodically, never taking her eyes off him. She still did not speak. Her silence was a language he was beginning to understand. It was not empty. It was full of observation, of memory, of judgment held in reserve. One afternoon, as a pale, watery sun filtered through the single grime-streaked window, he found her sitting up, tracing patterns in the ashen soot on the hearthstones. They were not the drawings of a child, no houses, no suns, no stick figures. They were intricate, swirling designs, spirals that coiled into themselves in sharp, geometric lines that intersected at odd angles. They were the patterns from her wrist, magnified and explored. She was drawing her identity, her connection to a world he had helped to shatter. He left her to her silent art. He sat at his table, cleaning his rifle, the familiar mechanical task a comfort. The cabin was filled with a fragile, dreamlike peace. It was the quiet of a deep forest, the sense that you are not alone, that you are being watched by something ancient and powerful. It was the quiet before the storm, that evening. As twilight bled purple and orange across the snow-covered peaks, she began to hum. It was a low, monotonous sound, more of a vibration than a melody. It was a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, ancient and resonant. He had heard songs like it before, from a distance, carried on the wind from encampments he was paid to spy on. It was a song of mourning, or perhaps of calling. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She was not humming for him. Her eyes were fixed on the window, on the dying light outside. Her voice was a thread, spinning itself out into the vast cold emptiness, searching for a connection. And he realized with a sudden gut-wrenching certainty that she was not humming for someone who was lost. She was humming for someone who was listening. The fragile peace of the cabin shattered. The air grew thick, heavy with anticipation. He felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The silence that descended when she stopped humming was more profound, more terrifying than any sound he had ever heard. It was the silence of a world that had heard her call and was now on its way to answer. The dawn came not as a light, but as a slow, gray dilution of the dark. Malachi had not slept. He had sat in his chair, his rifle across his lap, watching the girl as she slept a true, deep sleep for the first time. The humming had not returned. There was no need. The message had been sent. He felt their presence before he saw them. It was a change in the pressure of the air, a stillness that fell over the land that was different from the usual morning quiet. The jays that normally shrieked from the pines were silent. The wind itself seemed to have died down, afraid to move. He stood and walked to the window, his heart a heavy, rhythmic drum against his ribs. At first, there was only the fog, a thick, white blanket clinging to the valley floor. Then, a shape emerged on the ridge opposite his cabin. A single rider. on a pinto pony, as still as the rock he stood upon. He was a silhouette against the graying sky, a sentinel, a messenger. He carried no rifle, only a long feathered lance held upright. Malakai's breath caught in his throat. He watched, mesmerized, as another shape materialized out of the mist. To the rider's left, and another to his right. And then more and more still, until a line of 20 silent horsemen stood on the ridge, their forms indistinct in the fog, like spirits called forth from the earth. They were not adorned for war, but their stillness was more menacing than any battle cry. It was the stillness of absolute power, of patient, inevitable judgment. Then the line of riders parted. A man on foot began to descend the slope. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his long hair, the color of a raven's wing, streaked with silver. He wore a simple buckskin shirt and leggings, unadorned except for a single eagle feather tied in his hair. His face was a mask of granite and sorrow carved by seasons of hardship and leadership. He walked not with the arrogance of a conqueror, but with the heavy, deliberate tread of a man carrying the weight of his people. At his side, his hand resting on the shoulder of a boy of about 14, walked the chief. As they reached the flat ground before the cabin, the riders began to move, not charging, but flowing down the hillside like water, fanning out to form a silent, unbreachable semicircle around Malakai's small patch of land. They were a living wall of history, of memory, of pain. The land went so quiet that Malakai could hear the blood pounding in his ears. Every heartbeat was a clap of thunder in the cathedral of silence. The chief stopped 20 yards from the door. His eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto Malakai through the window pane. They were the same eyes as the girl's. They held the same ancient knowledge, the same bottomless grief. The boy beside him, his face a younger, prouder echo of the chief's, stared with an open, undisguised hatred. Malakai knew this was the moment. There was no running, no fighting, no bargaining. There was only the truth. He opened the cabin door. The cold morning air hit him like a physical blow. He stepped out onto the small porch, his rifle left behind. He stood there in his worn shirt and trousers, a solitary, broken man before the silent tribunal of a nation he had wronged. The chief's gaze flickered past him into the dark interior of the cabin. Then his eyes returned to Malakai, and they were as hard and unforgiving as the frozen ground beneath their feet. Someone spoke. It was the chief, his voice not loud, but carrying across the frozen air with the clarity of a cracking whip. The words were Apache, but the meaning was universal, unmistakable. Then he repeated them in the clipped, spare English he had learned from treaties and betrayals. You touched one of ours. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a claim. It spoke of possession, of blood right, of a line that had been crossed. It was the most profound accusation Malakai had ever heard. He did not try to explain. He did not beg. The excuses he had whispered to himself in the dark for 10 years turned to ash in his mouth. In the face of this immense, silent dignity, his guilt was absolute. Slowly, deliberately, Malakai lowered himself to the ground, first to one knee, then to both, his head bowed. He knelt in the snow before the Apache chief. It was not an act of fear. It was not a plea for mercy. It was an act of atonement, a surrender not to their power, but to the crushing weight of his own soul. He had been waiting for this judgment since the day he fled Ash Creek. It had finally come. They did not bind him. They did not drag him. When the chief, Nantan Lupin, gestured for him to rise and walk, Malakai obeyed. He was flanked by 2 warriors, their faces impassive, their presence a cage more secure than any iron bars. As he was led away from the cabin, the girl appeared in the doorway. She was wrapped in his wool blanket, her small face pale. Her eyes met his for a fraction of a second. There was no fear in them now, only a deep, unreadable gravity. She had called them, and they had come. her part was done. They took him not to a camp of war, but to a sheltered place deep within the canyon, a place of immense natural beauty. Ancient cottonwoods, their branches bare, stood like sentinels along a creek that ran clear and fast. Tipis, decorated with symbols of clan and personal history, were arranged in a wide circle. This was not a temporary camp. It was a home, a sanctuary hidden from the white man's world. He was brought to the center of the village, before a large, unlit fire pit. The people emerged from their lodges to watch him, their faces a mixture of sorrow, anger, and stark curiosity. He was a specter from the world that had brought them nothing but misery. He saw old men whose eyes held the weary memory of 100 broken promises, women whose faces were etched with the grief of lost children, and young men whose gazes burned with a fire for a vengeance they knew would be futile. Nanton Lupin stood before him. The boy, whom Malachi now understood was his son, stood at his right hand. The warrior who had first appeared on the ridge, a man with a jagged scar across his cheek named Kavano, stood to his left. The chief did not ask why. He had taken the girl. He did not ask what he had done to her. His questions cut deeper, to the heart of the matter. "She was silent with you," Nanton Lupin said, his English deliberate. "What did you hear in her silence?" Malachi looked at the hard, frozen ground. What had he heard? He had heard an accusation. He had heard the echo of his own crimes. He had heard a child's pain. "I heard what I deserved to hear," Malachi said, his voice raspy. "I heard the ghosts of Ash Creek." At the name, a collective hiss went through the assembled tribe. Nanton Lupin's eyes narrowed. The boy's hand went to the knife at his belt. "You know that name," the chief stated. "I was there," Malachi said, the confession ripping from him like a rotten tooth. "I was a scout for the Blue Coats. I led them." He finally lifted his head, meeting the chief's gaze, offering no defense, no excuse. He laid his soul bare for their judgment. He expected to be torn apart. He craved it. But Nanton Lupin simply held his gaze, a terrible sadness dawning in his eyes. "My brother, Din, the holy man," he spoke of a scout who knew the land like a brother, but who walked with the enemy. He said this scout had a white man's face, but an Apache shadow. He did not understand how a man could betray the land that gave him his spirit. The world tilted under Malachi's feet. Din. He remembered the name. He remembered the face of the shaman, a man of peace, as he stepped out of his tipi, his hands raised in a plea for reason, just before the first volley cut him down. "The girl you found," Nanton Lupin continued, his voice heavy with a grief that felt as old as the mountains, "is Istis, Snow. She is the daughter of Din. She is the only one who escaped the fire at Ash Creek." The breath left Malachi's body in a ragged gasp. It was not just any child. It was his child, the daughter of the man he had led Thorn's butchers to. His sin was not general. It was specific. It was personal. It was sitting in his cabin wrapped in his blanket. The grenade pin he had pulled was attached to the bomb that had been ticking in his own heart for a decade. He closed his eyes, waiting for the killing blow. "But you did not call us because you are the man who led the soldiers," Nanton Lupin sighed, and the words were so unexpected they forced Malachi's eyes open. "She called us because of what she saw." Kavano, the scarred warrior, stepped forward. "Istis has the sight. It runs in her father's blood. Days before the soldiers came for her and the small band she was with, she had a vision. She saw a man with a face of winter sorrow standing by a frozen creek. She saw him lift her from the snow. She saw the blue coat of the soldier who shot her buried under the earth by his hands. She saw that his spirit was a wasteland like her." Malachi stared, uncomprehending. This was beyond mercy, beyond coincidence. This was the realm of myth, of a fate so intricate and terrible he could not grasp it. His act was not random. It had been foreseen. He was not a savior. He was a piece in a story that had been written long before he arrived. You did not save her, Nanton Lupin said, his voice resonating with an authority that was both earthly and divine. You fulfilled a promise the spirits made to her. You stood between her and the land of ghosts. We have not come to take your life for what you did at Ash Creek. We have come to claim the debt you now owe for what you did at the Frozen Creek. The reckoning was not what he had expected. It was not death. It was something far more complex, far more profound. They were not here to punish his past, but to claim his future. As night fell, a great fire was built in the center of the village. The flames leaped high into the freezing air, painting the faces of the assembled people in dancing shades of orange and red. Drums began to beat, a slow, steady rhythm that was the heartbeat of the earth itself. It was a sound that vibrated in Malikai's bones, shaking loose all the certainties of his world. He stood where they had left him, a prisoner of their strange, solemn mercy. He watched as two women led Istis from one of the tipis. She was no longer the grimy, blood-caked waif from the creek. She was bathed, her dark hair shining, and she was dressed in a beautiful, soft white deerskin dress, intricately beaded in patterns of blue and silver. She looked like a small, sacred princess. She walked toward the fire with a composure that belied her years. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, and Malikai's heart seized with a cold dread. He had seen rituals before. He knew of funeral pyres, of offerings made to appease angry spirits. He thought he understood. They had saved her body, but her spirit, they believed, was broken. This was a death rite, a ceremony to send her to the land of ghosts to be with her father. He had brought her back only for this. The thought was unbearable. He lunged forward, his mind screaming a silent no. Wait, don't. Take me instead. My life for hers, it's my debt. Let me pay it. He was halfway to the fire when Kavano's arm shot out, blocking his path. The warrior's grip was like iron. This is not for you to understand, white man. Be still. You're going to burn her. Malachi rasped, struggling against the hold. For God's sake, she's just a child. Nanton Lupin turned his head slowly, his eyes reflecting the fire. We do not burn our children. We give them new names when they pass through fire and return to us. Malachi fell still, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a wave of awe and shame. He was a fool, seeing only his own world's brutality, his own world's God. Istis reached the edge of the firelight and stood before her chief. Nanton Lupin placed his hands on her small shoulders. His voice rose, chanting in the old tongue, telling the story of her clan, of her father's wisdom, of the fire that took him, of the snow that hid her, of her journey through the shadow lands, and of her return. He declared that the girl who was named Istis, Snow, had melted in the thaw of violence and returned to the earth. A new spirit now inhabited the body. He raised his voice to the watching sky, to the listening spirits. She is no longer the snow that covers the dead. She is the life that grows in the ashes. Her name is now Ina Hojo. A murmur of approval, of reverence, went through the people. Ina Hojo, life in balance, life in beauty. New beginning. Then Nanton Lupin turned his gaze to Malachi. But a life returned carries a debt. A name reborn requires a witness. You are her witness. You are the scar that proves the wound has healed. He beckoned Malachi forward. Kavano released him, and he walked on unsteady legs into the sacred circle, the heat of the fire on his face. You have a name, the chief said. Malachi. It is a name from your book of spirits, a messenger. But that is not who you are to us. He dipped his fingers into a small clay pot held by his son, withdrawing a smudge of blue clay, the color of twilight and deep water. You are the man who stood where our enemies stood, but did not act as they did. You are the man who buried the blue coat. You are the man who saw our daughter not as a savage, but as a life. He stepped forward and with a firm, deliberate motion, drew a single, sharp line of the blue clay across Malakai's eyes from temple to temple. The touch was cool, the pressure immense. It was a brand, a claim, a rechristening. "We will not take your name," Natin Lupin declared, his voice ringing in the cold night air. "We will give you a title, a burden. You are now known to the people as Baihe Wichita Yida." He leaned in close, his voice a low whisper for Malakai alone. "He who stands before the blue coats, it is not an honor. It is a leash. It means you will never again be one of them. And you can never be one of us. You will walk between worlds, a ghost to both. This is your payment." The drums swelled. Ina Hojo, the girl reborn, stepped forward. She looked up at Malakai, at the blue line that now marked him. She reached out her small hand, and for one breathtaking moment, she placed it on his cheek. It was a touch of forgiveness, of acknowledgement, of a bond forged in blood and prophecy that was beyond his comprehension. Then she turned and walked back to her people, leaving him standing alone by the fire, a man irrevocably, sacredly, and permanently undone. He did not stay. There was no place for him there. Before the next sunrise, he was sent away with a small parcel of food and his rifle. They did not guide him. They did not threaten him. They simply opened their circle and let him pass, melting back into the wilderness from which he had come. He walked for days, his mind a maelstrom of fire, drums, and the weight of the blue line across his face. He did not wash it off. It felt as though it had been etched into his very bone. He was no longer just Malakai, the haunted exile. He was Baihe Wichita Yida, a title, a burden, a man marked by a tribe he had helped to destroy. He never returned to his cabin. He couldn't. It was a part of a life that no longer belonged to him. He drifted, a ghost in the high country, seen occasionally by trappers or prospectors, a tall, silent man with a haunted look and a strange blue mark across his eyes, a man who seemed to be listening for something no one else could hear. He became a legend, a whispered story told around campfires. Some said he was a madman who had gone native. Others said he was a spirit, a protector of the high passes. No one knew the truth. He lived out his days as Natin Lupin had decreed. Between worlds, he was a shield. More than once, when patrols of blue coats pushed too far into the hidden canyons, they would find their trail markers moved, their water sources mysteriously fouled, their horses spooked by a shadowy figure on a ridge. He never drew blood. He never fired a shot. He simply stood before them, a silent, unnerving presence, a warning that turned them back. He vanished back into the vastness of the land, a man who belonged nowhere and therefore belonged to the land itself. His final act was one of silence, a life given over not to redemption, but to a long, quiet, and unending atonement. Years later, long after the last of the free bands had been forced onto reservations, a surveyor mapping the remote canyon stumbled upon a hidden alcove. On the smooth, protected surface of the rock wall, there were drawings, ancient pictographs of hunts, and spirits and newer ones, of men on horseback with rifles. And among them, a single final inscription, written not in paint, but etched into the stone itself with a piece of charcoal, in a language that was not of the people. The words were weathered, almost gone, a faint whisper on the canyon wall. They were the final entry in a story only the wind and the rocks would remember. It read, "He gave what the others never did, time and blood and silence.